everybody, my name's Ailie. I'm here at Monash University, part of CLEX, part of the new Centre of Excellence of, I don't know, what are we calling it these days? Weather of the 21st century, 21st century weather. So many name changes. But I'm going to talk to you today about drought in Australia. And the reason I'm going to talk to you about drought in Australia is it's a really nice example, a really nice story of how we have moved science of drought forward by using weather to investigate a climate scale phenomenon. Now, you would have also seen that all of you have a bingo card. Does anybody not have a bingo card? No? Fantastic. All right, you need to get a pen out. Some random words on there. So you've got to get either a horizontal line across, a vertical line, or a diagonal. That's okay. And basically, you're going to need to listen to me, because I know it's Thursday afternoon, right? This is day, what, 3, 4? I don't know what it is. I don't even know what day it is, right? But whoever gets bingo first, I've got some very cool little pins for those who win. So, listen up. Did you hear that? Very cool little pins for some people. I've got some pins. You've got to listen. All right? Okay, so let's get moving before I run out of time, because I don't know where things on my own campus are. All right, so let's start with talking about drought and thinking about what drought is. And drought really is what we might call a climate scale problem, right? So we're not necessarily, well, this is how we kind of always think of it, right? We always think of drought as a hazard that is kind of months or longer in duration. So this is an example from 1982 to 1983. This was kind of a 9-10 month period of very severe rainfall deficiencies. And I should say throughout this talk, I'm only going to refer to drought in terms of rainfall, because that's where I come from. And we're talking about weather, and that connects beautifully with rainfall. So I will be talking mostly about rainfall, and I will be focusing much of the stuff that we're talking about on South East Australia, because that's where the research has been done. So, but the point is here, you can see the very red areas show periods where we've got very much below average rainfall or record low average rainfall for that 10-month period. And this was a really severe drought, culminated in the Ash Wednesday fires, which were in February 1983 throughout South Australia and Victoria, and things didn't end well there. So that's kind of an example of a multi-month drought, but we've also got droughts that can last a lot longer. So we've got droughts that can go for years. This is an example of what we call the millennium drought. So a lot of people might have heard of this one. This was pretty much in the first decade of the new millennium, where everything in South East Australia was very, very dry and very, very dry for a long time. So this was primarily concentrated in southern New South Wales, Victoria, and parts of Queensland as well. And of course, the most recent example is the tinderbox drought, which is from 2017 to 2019 through much of eastern Australia, where in particular wintertime rainfall deficits were really, really low. So drought, fundamentally, as it is manifest on the ground to people who care about it, farmers, water resource managers, things like that, it's a climate scale problem, right? So, here's a big question for you, and I've got this Rorschach type ink blot here to make suggestions to your brains about what causes drought in Australia. So if I say what causes drought in Australia, what's the first thing that comes to mind that is synonymous with drought in Australia? And hopefully this thing is kind of, don't put your hand out, just shout out. El Nino, right. This is, I seriously put this in an AI generator. This is a Rorschach ink blot generated image of sea surface temperature patterns, which I thought was really cool, actually. All right. So El Nino is synonymous, right, with drought in this country. Everybody goes a bit nuts when an El Nino is forecast, because they say, oh, we're going to fall into drought. And of course, this is because this is where the research started. So back in 1983, there was a very seminal paper, had its 40th anniversary last year, and in fact, a review paper is currently being written about how far we've come in our knowledge since then. At the moment, but this is a paper by John McBride and Neville Nichols, who are two of the people that really kind of first discovered this relationship between the El Nino Southern Oscillation and rainfall in Australia. And so they were looking at things like the SOI, or back then the Southern Oscillation and Darwin pressure, Tahiti pressure, etc., etc. And they showed that there was this distinct correlation, and these are the original plots, particularly in springtime. So this is, this is winter time, but they also showed springtime, and they showed the strong relationships between a whole bunch of different indices of the El Niño Southern Oscillation and monthly scale rainfall in Australia. And so this was kind of the first paper that really said rainfall is connected to both wet periods and dry periods, and in particular to drought. And of course, I'm going to make the assumption that you all vaguely know about El Niño, the El Niño Southern Oscillation, and we have warmer ocean temperatures in the tropical Pacific Ocean that tend to lead to a reduced chance of rainfall, particularly across eastern Australia, and some of the correlations are quite strong there. And of course, as the science moved on, you know, it's a climate scale problem, so we look at climate scale processes. That's kind of how our minds work, right? At least that's what we kind of think about. And so as we move on, there were lots of studies that kind of moved from looking at Pacific Ocean air-sea interactions to Indian Ocean air-sea interactions. So another one is the Indian Ocean Dipole, or the IOD. Where they looked at this relationship between these ocean temperatures in the east and west of the Indian Ocean, and how that changed circulation patterns to lead to a reduced chance of rainfall in southeastern Australia. And so again, we've got a climate scale hazard, therefore we're looking at climate scale causes. So by the time we kind of get into the late 90s, the early 2000s, even the mid 2000s, we're still investigating drought from this climate scale perspective. People started to have a look at things like, as I said, ENSO and El Niño, IOD, or positive Indian Ocean dipole events. We started to get into more intraseasonal stuff too at that time. So in the mid-2000s, there were a whole bunch of papers looking at something called the subtropical ridge. So this is kind of the climate imprint of the climatological belt of high pressure that sits broadly over the Australian continent and moves north and south with the seasons. So this is kind of the descending branch of the Hadley cell. So people were looking at the spatial extent, they were looking at the mean intensity of the subtropical ridge, the general latitude of the subtropical ridge, to try and understand, in this sense, because the millennium drought had started by the early 2000s, why we were getting a rainfall reduction in southeastern Australia in the early part of the 2000s. So people were starting to go down to this intraseasonal scale, and they were starting to touch on aspects of that were a little less climaty and a little more weathery, if that makes sense. So going from kind of monthly scale phenomena down to multi-week phenomena, so starting to look at things like atmospheric blocking, the southern annular mode, and thinking about how those were connected to rainfall. But as I said, all this was done in the context of the millennium drought. So this is where at the early, if you want to think timeline, we're in the early to mid 2000s by now. But during the millennium drought, something else happened. As people started looking at these subtropical ridges and things on monthly timescales, some people, in particular Pandora Hope from the Bureau and Mike Pook, who I think was at the Bureau at the time, both started looking at rainfall declines rather than thinking about it as drought. They started looking at rainfall declines in terms of weather systems. So Pandora's work on the left there basically just shows different synoptic typings. I think she was using self-organising maps. She focused on a rainfall decline that had occurred in southwest Western Australia since about the 1970s. So there it was a decline, it was not a drought, right? It was a shift in rainfall that from the mid-1970s, rainfall dropped by about 30% in winter, and it's never gone back, and it hasn't gone back since, right? That's a rainfall decline, and I want to distinguish that rainfall decline with drought, which is a temporary state, right? But the same thing started happening in the southeast, and so people started to get worried, well, are we following Perth, basically? Are we following the southwest? So as I said, this was in the context of the rainfall decline and this millennium drought, wondering whether it was a permanent shift or whether this was a hallmark of drought. So Mike Pook applied some work to to that, particularly in Western Victoria, because that was one of the big hot spots for where the millennium drought was really biting by kind of 2002, 2003 and 5 and 6. And he is a meteorologist by trade. I'll tell you a bit more about Mike Pook later because he's a wonderful guy. But he was a meteorologist for many, many years, like an operational meteorologist. And so he has lots of synoptic maps in his head. And so he went through and quite literally, manually pulled out, drew on these maps and did an analysis of frontal systems and cut-off low pressure systems, manually, for areas in Western Victoria from the late 1960s. Hey! How many did we have then? Perfect, all right. Come and get your, well done. Hang on, I'm gonna pull my things out. Melissa, can you have 4, was it?
I think it was 4. 1, oh no, 5.
5? Okay,
5.
Fantastic. All right, they can choose from these. Just one each, but they can choose from either one.
Oh, okay.
So whoever. Wow, that was quick. Oh, Melissa.
Try again. Should I drama? Over.
That's very funny. We'll save that one for another one later. All right. So, as I said, there was a shift in thinking during the millennium drought because people were starting to worry that this rainfall wouldn't go back. So, as I said, Mike Pook, he was fantastic at manually looking at these cut-off lows, and basically what he found was that for a region in Western Victoria, what you can see on the right here is seasonal rainfall in the light grey colour. This black is rainfall from what he worked out as cut-off lows. Now, these were surface lows, okay? And then fronts as well. So he attributed rainfall to fronts as well, and that's what's shown in the square thing here. And what you can see is that the majority of the seasonal rainfall, I should say this is cool season rainfall, so this is kind of April to October, and during the millennium drought, this is the time of year where the rainfall was really dropping off. So that's why he focused on that. And what you can see here is that two things. You can see that the cut-offs are responsible for the majority of the rainfall as opposed to the fronts. And you can also see that the decline in rainfall basically mirrors the reduction in the cut-offs, not the fronts, right? When he looked into this further, he had a look at kind of a frequency and intensity metric, so that's the bottom plot on the right here. So cut-off days, that's the number of days where you get a cut-off low moving through this area of Western Victoria in the square lighter grey colour. And then the darker colour is the amount of rain per cut-off, right? So how intense these cut-offs actually are. And so from that, you can see a reduction in both, basically since the mid-1990s, but you can see that during the millennium drought, it was really about the intensity of these cut-offs that were declining, right? So this was the first time that somebody actually looked at a reduction in drought from a kind of heavier rainfall perspective, right? And this was really the start of, I mean, in hindsight anyway, people didn't know it at the time, but this was really a start of a complete shift in thinking about how we think about at least the rainfall declines and drought in southern Australia. So now we get into kind of post-millennium drought thinking. The drought broke in 2009, and as I said, those two papers that I just described were looking at rainfall declines, thinking that they were potentially a permanent or quasi-permanent shift, as was the case in Perth or southwest Western Australia. But then the drought broke. All right, over here, the drought broke, the millennium drought broke. But it kind of raised a question because then more people started asking, do we need to start thinking about drought in a different way? And that's illustrated on what I'm going to show you here. So here in the blue colours, like the blue time series, what we see is a time series of what we call the standardised precipitation index, the 1 month standardised precipitation index. Now, all the standardised precipitation index is it takes rainfall at a particular site, monthly rainfall or 3 monthly average or 6 monthly average, whatever you want, and it basically standardises the distribution. The distributions are fairly normal, sometimes they're a bit skewed, so it does some fancy things in there, but it fundamentally changes it to a standardised normal distribution. So -1, -2, -3 represents standard deviations, right? So this is monthly from 1980. And what I've done here is I've highlighted in the brown dashed boxes those periods where we had severe droughts in this region in southeastern Australia, okay? So you can see the 1982-83 drought that I spoke about before, the Millennium drought, the big long one in the middle here, and then the tinderbox drought over to the right. Have we got a question at the back? No, that's fine. I only had pins for the winners, so sorry. I do have a couple of extra if you're really desperate at the end. So the interesting thing about this, though, is what I want you to look at is I want you to look at the red dots, the light blue dots, and the dark blue dots. The red dots indicate months that are below 1 standard deviation, okay, below the mean. So somewhat unusual months, unusually dry months, right? And then the red line shows 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. The blue horizontal line shows 1.5 above, right? So there's something interesting here. And what I want you to have a look at is, particularly when you compare, maybe not after 2010, but if you actually go through and count the dots, which I did, I won't make you count the dots, but if you go through and count the dots in the period, say, outside the boxes between 1983 and 1996, and then you count the dots within the periods of kind of this millennium drought and things like that, if you compare the likelihood of getting dry months in those two periods, it's about the same. It's actually about the same. There's probably no statistically significant difference. So that's not always true. Those really intense drought periods, you can see in 1982-83 was just dry, right? But in those multi-year drought periods, there's something else interesting that's happening at the other end of the spectrum. Can anybody notice what it is?
It's the high rainfall.
Right. So within these droughts, there are no periods where we have very wet months. Very wet months, by kind of like that I'm talking about 1.52 standard deviations above the mean. We get periods where there's average rainfall, we get periods where there's above average rainfall. That's fine. But we don't get really wet periods. And people started noticing this when we were kind of all starting to do this assessment of the Millennium Drought after it happened, and we were like, oh my gosh, could that happen again? It lasted 13 years, we almost ran out of water here in Melbourne, it was all a big disaster. So people wanted to know what happened. And that's what people started noticing. And it's quite clear that if you look across Australia, particularly in the south and the east, that droughts that are longer than around 6 months tend to be characterised not by the presence of very dry, continually very, very dry conditions, but instead by the absence of large precipitation anomalies on the monthly scale. Okay, so here we're still talking about climate here, right? Right. So that was one thing people noticed. And so the next question, oh, and sorry, I should show, this is from a paper by a former PhD student of mine, Mustafa Adamu, and he kind of looked at this in terms of the distribution of monthly rainfall again. So this is standardised, again, this is the 1 month SPI, and he just broke it down into decades. And you can kind of see what I was talking about again just here, because every decade is different, right? If we go back, the 1950s was kind of wet, the 1970s was kind of wet, parts of the 1990s were kind of wet, 2000 to 2009 was very dry, the 60s were very dry. But if we have a look at these distributions, the really interesting thing about this is that it's not that low tail that's changing very much. In fact, the 1990s, if you look at monthly rainfall, this is again for southeastern Australia, the tails actually reached further dry than in the height of the millennium drought. But what is changing is the upper tails. It's the skew, right? And it's that skew that are those heavy rainfall events. So what I hope I've shown you so far is that these wet months are the things that disappear during drought. Yes, you get periods of intense dry, and to be honest, that's usually what kind of kicks off the drought in the first place, when you get these prolonged periods of dry. But what maintains a drought, what sustains a drought, is this lack of very wet months. I'm going to say months because we're still on the climate scale here. So now the question becomes, why do these wet months disappear? Where do they go? So the first question we need to ask, why are wet months wet? Right? What's going on? What's happening at the daily scale to work out, that dictates what a wet month is, okay? A very wet month in particular. So what I've done here is I've just pulled data from a high quality rainfall station in Birchip in northwestern Victoria. And this is the station that Mike Pook used in his analysis too. And I pulled out the very wettest months, basically the months where there was over 100 mil of rain. This is a very dry part of Victoria, okay? So when you get over 100 mil in a month, it's a very wet month in Birchip. There's only 20 of them in a record that spans from 1890 to today, okay? Very dry. And the commonality of all these wet months is not that it was just raining all the time, right? It wasn't that there was this system and all of a sudden it just stayed and it just rained all the time and we got kind of 10, 20 mils a day and it slowly built up. Instead, what we see is these big peaks. And what I've put on here in the dashed red lines are the equivalent of the 95th, 99th and 99.5th percentile of daily rainfall. Now, sorry, I should say not daily rainfall. That's the 99.5th, 99th and 95th of days of rain above 1 millimetre. So we're actually taking a subset here. So these are the wettest of wettest of wettest of wet days, right? And what you can see in all years, okay, so I've just taken four random years here, okay? So the yellow is 1 year, and this is through the month. So this is day 1 of the month, day 31 of the month. 1 month only had 30, but I just took random ones just to kind of illustrate this point, right? So this is September 1916, December 1930, March 1956 and May 1995. Those are the times. But what you see is that there's at least one event in the month that reaches that 99.5th percentile. So it's very extreme. Sometimes 2. Or there might be a period of 3 days, something like that, where you're above the 95th. But the point is, it's very few rain days. It might be 1, it might be 2, it might be 3. But it's not 15 days, it's not 30 days. It's just a few. So in other words, what this shows us, and I'll show you more in a minute from published work, is that wet months are wet because they have a single or multiple days, maybe 2, maybe 3, but usually only 2 or 1, that are very wet in themselves. So they have an extreme daily scale rainfall event within that month. That's why wet months are wet. All right, to set the context up for the rest of the talk, I just want to, and how we're going to investigate these heavy rain days and some of the stuff that's been happening in this space, is I just want to go through now a way that we used in some of the work that I did here with my team on how we investigate heavy rainfall days. So this is one method that we've used, but I should say that we've also investigated this using other methods that aren't, well, yeah, different methods, and we get fundamentally the same result, okay? But I'll explain what's going on here. So what this shows is a time series. So the light blue, very high frequency squiggles are this standardised precipitation index. This time averaged over a 3-month period. So they're kind of 3-month running averages, right? This is from the year 1900 to, I think, the year 2019, okay? Now, this is just for a representative station in Goulburn in New South Wales, okay? So you can see If we're looking at 3-month averages, things go up, things go down. What we wanted to do was trying to investigate how heavy rainfall days changed during different phases of drought. So what we did is we said that droughts don't necessarily begin and end in short time frames, right? Remember I showed you the Millennium Drought before that lasted for 13 years, or the Tinderbox Drought that lasted for 3 years. I also showed you that time series that within that you can get 3-month, 4-month periods of average rainfall, right? But that doesn't mean the drought is broken. So what we did is, instead of looking at kind of traditional ways of defining drought by saying, oh, when the rainfall gets back to normal for a little while, it's broken, because really the impacts don't show that. Actually, the impacts keep going. We actually looked at something called the cumulative standardised precipitation index. So instead of looking at the standardised precipitation going up and down and we say, oh yeah, it's below normal and then it goes back to normal, we looked at the cumulative standardised precipitation index, and we can think of this like a bucket, right? Let's think of this like a bucket of water. Basically, when this smooth line, so this red, you can see this red line here and the smoothed version on top of it, when that goes down, that means your bucket is emptying, right? That means you're getting negative anomalies, so you're not getting normal rainfall, you're getting less than normal rainfall. When it's going up, it's filling. Basically, you're getting positive anomalies. So think of it in that way. And so we defined drought onset as a period where we had to have that intense dry for a long time. This is a common method that's used in a lot of other literature. So we said this standardised precipitation index needed to be below -1 for 6 months. Again, that's been used a lot of times before. So we said, okay, that's when the drought starts. But we're going to say that the drought is maintained or keeps developing for the period of time after onset where that bucket continues to empty, right? And we're going to then define a period where we're recovering from drought. We don't necessarily end drought in terms of its impacts. They might not end for a little time after this point, but basically at that inflection point, right? Where the bucket is starting to refill, all right? So that's how we define these things called development and recovery phases, which you'll see through the rest of this talk. Okay, now this is a busy graph. So I'm going to try and explain it in detail. But fundamentally what it shows is we then started to look at these days of heavy rain, okay? And these days of heavy rain, in this paper, we described using absolute thresholds. But we've also done some other work describing it using percentiles, kind of like I showed before. Okay, so 90th percentile, 95th percentile of wet days, things like that. And you get the same result, okay? The top row of maps shows what happens during the development phase. The bottom row of maps shows what happens during the recovery phase. Now let's concentrate on the graphs on the left here, okay? So these ones here in the bright red and the bright red in recovery and development. What this shows, and I should say, sorry, the colours here show the thresholds that we used when we were thinking about days of rain. So the dark blue here shows no rain, the light blue up to 5 mil, 5 to 10 mil, 10 to 20 mil, 20 to 50 mil and above 50 mil, right? What this shows is where you get the largest relative change in frequency of a particular type of event. So when it's red here, it's saying during the development phase, we get the largest change, the largest relative change in the number of days that are either 20 to 50 mil or above 50 mil. In other words, those heavy rain days. But the interesting part of this is if you look at that frequency value, not in a relative sense, but in an absolute sense, the number of days that change between drought, recovery and development is actually tiny. It's tiny. And I'll get to that in a second. But what I really want you to concentrate on is this middle column here. So the top and the bottom, basically, actually, let's just go back to the left here. What this shows fundamentally is that the top and the bottom show recovery and development. It shows that when you get a drought, the development phase of the drought, the largest change in the relative frequency of the number of rain days all comes down to the heavy rainfall days, because it's all red. Not light rainfall days, not no rainfall days, heavy rainfall days, because it's all red. The middle column shows a similar thing, but instead of looking at the frequency of these days, it shows their contribution to monthly, what's this? No, actually this is annual in this sense, rainfall totals. So the contribution, so if we think about the contribution of, say, days above 20, or between 20 and 50 mil to the annual rainfall total, we looked at that, and I'll show you later, it contributes about 50-ish%, depending on where you are, right? What this shows is that the largest change in the contribution to annual precipitation in the development phase on top and the recovery phase on bottom, again, is in the red. So it comes from these heavy rainfall days. So that's where you're getting your biggest changes in the contribution to those seasonal and annual rainfall totals. Now, the interesting part here on the right is that we then ask the question, well, how many days is this? If most of our rainfall, if most of the change in our seasonal accumulations, our annual accumulations are coming for these heavy rainfall days, how many days actually matter, right? Is it 10 days? Is it 20 days? What is it? And the answer shocked us. It was anywhere from like 2 to 5, depending on where you were. So what this tells us, and what this analysis tells us, is that basically a handful of heavy rain days, someone just got bingo, a handful of heavy rain days can make or break a drought. All it takes is a few big rainfall events to disappear or to reduce, to put us in drought, and all it takes to get us out of drought is for those rainfall events to come back. So that's what this paper showed. We did a bit of digging into this a bit further in a big group paper that I think some of you in this room were on in Science Advances earlier this year, where we looked at the tinderbox drought, which was 2017 to 2019. And part of that was we did an analysis of the synoptic events. This time, as I said, instead of looking at thresholds, we looked at what you might call heavy rain days. So we used the threshold here as the 90th percentile, right? Could use 95th, again, shows similar differences. And what we found was, this shows basically, these box plots show that all the reductions in the amount of rainfall contributing to the seasonal and annual totals that comes from that heavy rainfall for all these grid boxes within this region, which is kind of defined as a tinderbox drought region. And what you can see, particularly in winter, which is where these deficits were most prominent during this drought, basically winters were just very dry, was that you see this big reduction in these days above the 90th percentile, okay? And if you want to look at numbers, basically what we found was that the changes to seasonal rainfall totals, particularly during winter, heavy rainfall, that days, which is those days above the 90th percentile, they went down in an annual sense anywhere to 50%. In June, July, August, where it was the worst, it was from 30 to 50%. But those non-heavy rainfall days, in fact those days below the 90th percentile, went up. So you got more lighter rainfall days and no heavy rainfall days. And that contribution of the heavy rainfall days decreased by anywhere from kind of 30 to 50% in those months. Now have a think about this. Those rain days above the 90th percentile, let's take June, July, August as an example, contribute about 51% of the seasonal accumulation on average. So if you're taking away half that rainfall, all of a sudden you've got a 25% drop in rainfall by just losing those events. And that comes from 1 to 3 days or 1 to 3 days worth of rain. Could be a single event that goes over 2 days. So what you see now is that as we take a weather perspective on this climate problem, we get these really interesting revelations about what is causing the drought. And it can change our thinking on then how we might, well, I'll talk about this later, but thinking about how we might use that information for prediction and things like that. So from this, a PhD student here at Monash, Chen-Hui Jin, has been doing a lot of analysis on this and starting to have a look more closely at what is going on these heavy rainfall days. And this is a paper he published end of last year, start of this year in Journal of Climate, that basically shows that particularly during the summer, this is for southeastern Australia, winter too, but particularly during the summer, basically what this shows is it orders all the years into the driest to the wettest years, so driest on the left, wettest on the right. The dark blue bits show what the heavy rainfall part contributed to. Now, in this sense, he used the top quartile, okay, but this is heavy rainfall days. Again, you can muck around with what thresholds you use, but you always get the same answer, right? As long as it's in that upper tail. But what he found was that particularly during summer, it's the heavy rainfall that disappears. You can see basically the bit that's the whiter bit or the open part of the column doesn't change as much as the blue part. That's what that's showing. All right? Okay, so now we've established that wet months disappear because of days of heavy and extreme rainfall. Let's take the next step. Let's look at the processes that are causing this. Why? Let's take it back to Pook. This is Mike Pook. Lovely guy. He was, if anybody grew up in Tasmania, oh, you're all younger than me, but anybody who grew up in Tasmania in the 80s and 90s, he was the TV weatherman for many years. So they all know him and love him. But he was actually an operational forecaster for the Bureau of Meteorology. So let's take it back to Pook, and let's take it back to the idea of cut-off lows. Because particularly in southeastern Australia, this is what was shown during the millennium drought. In hindsight, when they did this study, they thought it was just a decline that wasn't going to, well, could potentially not shift back. But in hindsight, this was a drought. So let's take these ideas and look at them further. Let's think about cut-offs, because quite clearly they contribute a lot of rainfall. But are all cut-offs equal? This is the next question. What makes a heavy rain system as opposed to a non-heavy rain system? We can get cut-offs coming through here in Victoria, for example, and sometimes they'll only drop 5 mils, but sometimes they'll drop 50. So what makes them different? And so Chen-Hui, what he did was have a look at a whole bunch of parts that make up these weather systems. And so he looked at, he basically got a data set from some people at ETH and had a look at all these different what we call weather objects. So we looked at cyclones, anticyclones, fronts, warm conveyor belts, two different aspects of warm conveyor belts, basically how much air is moving into a warm conveyor belt. So these are usually ahead of the fronts part of a mid-latitude cyclone, and then how far that stuff was ascending, right? He looked at cut-off lows, he looked at PV streamers, he looked at all sorts of things. And he looked at what was important here for these heavy rainfall events. First of all, he went back and established what we had thought. That's Tess Parker and myself in that other paper that I showed with the complicated graphic. But here, this is for a region in southeastern Australia. If we have a look, and he used the same kind of criteria of drought development and recovery, but if he looked at drought development and recovery and looked at the difference associated with what he's defining as these heavy rainfall events, you can see the big reductions are coming from these heavy rainfall events. So the red shows it's kind of up to 2 to 3, sometimes even 4 mils a day, which kind of equates, you know, over a season. This is in particular for autumn. This equates to, you know, hundreds of mils of rain. All right. So what he found in his paper, when he looked, this is just for June, July, August, and December, January, February, was 2 things. He found the importance of warm conveyor belts, but he also found that things changed in this region, depending on whether you're in summer or winter, and later I'll show you in the other seasons too. But in particular, warm conveyor belts and PV streamers in the winter were the most important. So it was changes in those weather objects, and then he decomposed this into, well, is it the intensity of the rainfall coming from these objects? Is it a frequency thing? Like, are these objects getting less frequent, or is it just an intensity thing? And what he found when he decomposed that was that it was an intensity thing, which matches what Pook found too. Remember the rain per cutoff, right? So frequency is important, but intensity was a major factor. But of course, this does change from drought to drought. So here's a couple of pieces of analysis from a paper that he's recently submitted to JGR Atmospheres, looking specifically at the Millennium Drought. Now, the Millennium Drought, the biggest rainfall reduction was in autumn. Early winter too, but it was in autumn, okay? And you can see what happened in autumn in the Millennium Drought to these warm conveyor belt inflow and ascent aspects, and also to cyclones. These are surface cyclones, okay? Which are kind of more equivalent to Pook's cutoffs than what we're defining as cutoffs, which are mid-level cutoffs, okay? So you can see that the intensity part of this is really important. The frequency part is important too, more important than if we take a broader climatological view, as in this paper here. Tinderbox drought. So this is an average over the Millennium Drought. This is an average over a whole bunch of years. But on the right here, this shows the individual years of the Tinderbox Drought. So this one up here in the top left is actually the year before the drought started. Okay? So the year before the drought started, we actually had an increase. There was a larger a larger amount of rainfall attributable to these warm conveyor belts. And then during the winters of the Tinderbox Drought, you can see that that fell through the floor. Now, the numbers there show you where that year was ranked for the changes in these systems. This is a data set from 1980, so that you can see, particularly in the final year, the changes to warm conveyor belts intensity and to PV streamers and things like that were at or near the lowest on record. And in fact, some other papers, Acacia Pepler, also showed that the number of cut-off systems, I think across the main area in New South Wales of the Tinderbox Drought was, I think there was maybe 1 or 0 there were none. Usually they'd expect, 3, 4, 5, but there were none in that winter. So this is very consistent with other work. But my point here is that particularly in JJA, we showed the importance of both streamers and warm conveyor belts, and you can see that those are the things that changed the most during the Tinderbox Drought. And I don't have the March, April, May for the climatological view here, but you can see that particularly during the Millennium Drought, it was the cyclones and again the warm conveyor belts. Whoops. So what's happening to the warm conveyor belts? Chen Hui's looked into this as well. So when we say warm conveyor belts, this picture on the left is kind of what we're talking about, okay? You can also think of them as, like it's part of a mid-latitude cyclone, okay? It's really where you're tapping into moisture from somewhere, it's entering a deep low pressure system, and then it's raining out, right? So what Chen Hui found, if you look at the left column here, this is the development and this is the recovery, and this is the average of all events, all heavy rainfall events over that region during the left development period and the right the recovery period for up the top this warm conveyor belt inflow. So this is the number of, this is done by back trajectory analysis, and it's the number of trajectories that actually enter into what's defined as the warm conveyor belt. And then the bottom one here shows the ascent rate. Okay, so once these parcels enter that warm conveyor belt, how quickly they ascend. And both are important to rainfall. So what you can see here, I probably should have made this image a little bit bigger, but during the development period, basically the ascent rate is a lot lower, okay, compared to the recovery period, and the amount of stuff moving into the cyclone during the development period is less than in the recovery period. So what was happening though? Let's take a slightly broader view. Because what Chen Hui then did was then he had a look at how much rainfall was attributable to these things over space and time. So when we think about these individual weather objects contributing to rainfall, and heavy rainfall at that, sorry, I should say, what was going on in the development period on the left and the recovery period on the right? So these are basically Hofmöller diagrams from day -5 of a system moving across this area in southeastern Australia. The area in southeastern Australia is shown by these magenta dotted lines. So moving from kind of near Western Australia to 120 east, right over to past New Zealand at 180, right? And what he found was something really interesting. First of all, the systems were weaker during the millennium drought, for sure. Okay, so the ascent wasn't as strong, right? You can see that here, the maximums compared to the recovery period afterwards are a lot lower. But the other interesting thing that he found here is note within the magenta lines. During the millennium drought, the ascent rates were very low in the magenta lines, and the amount of rainfall attributable to that was very low. The maximum, though, moved east. During the recovery period, there is a maximum to the east, but there's a secondary maximum over our region of interest. So in other words, the take-home conclusion here is that during the millennium drought, the Tasman Sea stole all our rain. There was less rain, but that rain that did fall fell out in the Tasman Sea, not over us. So that's really interesting if you think about taking that broader perspective. Because weather systems don't just stop when they hit the edge of the Australian continent, for example, right? The other aspect of this was that he looked at the speed of systems, because there's been some work, I know Michael Barnes has been talking to you, and I'm not sure if he spoke about his paper that kind of showed the stationarity of systems. Well, Chen Hui looked at this too in terms of the heavy rainfall events that he was looking at. And interestingly, what he found was that rainfall systems that did bring rain spent less time over southeastern Australia during the development phase of drought than during the recovery. So in other words, as the drought was happening and being maintained and sustained, those systems that were moving through faster. Whereas during the recovery period, the systems were moving slower and hanging around over the region of interest. So not only were the systems themselves changing, the amount of rainfall changing, but they were also moving faster over the region. You can imagine if it's moving faster, it's bringing less rainfall, right? Because it doesn't hang out and rain out over you. Now, the other aspect of this, which is less well known, and there's a few people working on this stuff at the moment. I know Zoe Gillett's been working on this stuff, Chen Hui's been working on this stuff, Chiara Holgate's been working on this stuff, is around moisture supply. Because there's quite interesting work showing, the role of sea surface temperatures in supplying moisture to these systems. But there's also questions about, well, is it the ocean temperatures that are changing, that are supplying moisture, or is it the dynamics of the systems themselves that just mean that they're not that efficient? And that's still a very open question. And I'm rapidly running out of time, which is good because I'm at the end. So, the fundamental point here is that heavy rain days, at least from this body of work that I've just shown you, we're really starting to realise that it's heavy rain days that make and break droughts, right? And definitely via dynamic changes, but we think via thermodynamic changes as well, but we're less clear about how that's working, okay? But the point is it's changes to weather systems. The other key point here is that because they're very heavy rain days, they equate to just a few days worth of rain in a year or a season. So we're talking about only a few days of rain. Kind of just said that. But that focus on those systems and that focus on those findings really does make drought now potentially a much more tractable problem than it was. Because when we're looking at drought from a we're looking at drought from a climate perspective, things are very muddy, right? We can find these correlations, they're nice, they're neat, but they're strong, but we don't quite understand them. When we're looking at it from a weather perspective, and if we can say, actually, most of the change, or the changes in drought from a meteorological perspective, anyway, that we see, are due to these single systems, that kind of brings it back to, well, if we can understand those systems, if we can predict those systems, not saying we can, but if we can predict those systems, we can predict drought. And in particular, we can predict the end of droughts. We can predict when droughts end, because the return of these events is what causes the drought to end and to be maintained as well. This makes a big difference for prediction from anywhere from sub-seasonal to seasonal climate forecasting. This is an example right here of what's going on now. So basically, since I've got March to May here, but these deficits have been going on since kind of February, really. So we're now kind of in month 4 in far southern Australia, southeastern Australia, from southern South Australia right through to southern Victoria, Tasmania, of what is I'm not going to call it a drought yet, but it's an emerging drought situation. Okay? On the right here is the current forecast of extreme wet from the Bureau for July to September. And you can kind of see that it's, as best as I can tell from their dodgy colour scheme, because I can't quite tell the difference, it's a below normal chance of these heavy rain events. Right? So if we can link those two, that tells us that at the moment, from the seasonal forecast, is the drought less likely to break because we've got a lower chance of these extreme wet events. But we can also think about this for climate change predictions as well. And this is some work by Chiara Holgate, came out in Weather and Climate Extremes at the end of last year, that basically looked at these types of systems, or a similar type of system, in climate models. So Chiara identified that it was a combination of a deep low over southeastern Australia and a high in the Tasman Sea. That was kind of the weather pattern that was associated with these heavy rainfall events that were the drought breakers, right? And what she found was, on the top here we have the change in frequency of those kind of systems, and I'm just highlighting the ones in red. On the top right is the intensity of those systems, and on the bottom it's the change in the monthly rainfall that we see from those systems. And what she showed was that in the climate models she looked at anyway, there was a reduction in the frequency of those systems. And so the conclusion from this, and it was quite robust across multiple climate models, so the conclusion from this is that in the future in southern Australia, perhaps droughts are going to be less likely to be broken once they start. All right. That's pretty much all from me. I've said all that, so I'm going to stop there. Thanks.